one might then take a different kind of view, the kind of view that Armstrong, for instance, takes, facts are complexes of particulars and universals, and they only exist when a particular instantiates the universal. Of course, we know that Spinoza is not that doesn't really universal, so these kinds of things will not be useful for him as well. So if we only use facts in either of these cases, either realism about facts where it's understood in such as the Armstrong or deflationary theories of facts where it's just a way of solving involving they can't be Spinoza. One way of going about is to look at what Spinoza has available within his theory as a way of doing the work that facts were called for. One was as truth makers for propositions. So the proposition is true, it is a truth maker, it is a fact false. Now one might go for a different kind of theory of truth makers where the truth maker is a trope. It's a particular thing, particular property which cannot be shared across substances. And well, if we can see that if a particular trope of this kind exists, it actually makes propositions true, such as my running exists only when I'm insofar as I'm running. And its existence is just going to make true the proposition that I'm running. Now we can see that tropes of this kind are actually within Spinoza's on top. And what is that? They are modes of singular modes. So within Spinoza's general theory, we can find something that does this work that facts are called for, and we can now make do without talk of facts at all. So now we can talk in terms of state PSR without dealing with facts as well. And we're going to do it in terms of these modes of modes inhering in singular things. But it turns out that I think this will only be easily statable for monadic, for the monadic case where the monadic property is actually singular thing. So mode of mode inheres. Dealing with relations is going to pose some trouble. And quantification is also going to be an issue. But at least if we go this way, we'll stay within the bounds of things that Spinoza explicitly accused. But even if we go this far, I think it's possible to generate a version of PSR which goes, as it were, beyond what Spinoza states, and it goes, rather than just in P11 demonstration where he was only talking about existence of things, it could be singular things, could be substance, but in that respect I might disagree then. But even in that case, we can get existence of these particular tropes can make predications like X is F true, X is being F will be available. So we'll get a whole lot of facts out of, as it were, facts from this kind of thesis. But I believe it's still going to be difficult to attribute a more general version of this PSR. We can attribute that to Spinoza in some way, perhaps by just, this is the kind of reconstruction. But going beyond that to include universal facts and relational facts, facts in quotation marks, but this is just my way of shortening, is going to be problematic because those means are not available to Spinoza. There requires some logical vocabulary, other things that Spinoza not only doesn't appeal to, but since he doesn't state since he doesn't actually use PSR explicit in the ways that you suggest, this might be all that he can get out of it, that this kind of monadic predication PSR. And in that case, he wouldn't be, you should have more doubts about attributing the fault scale PSR, where all kinds of predications are accounted for in terms of its principle. So I just realized that I might have taken a little too long taking this kind of solution, but I was trying to offer you a way of reading Spinoza, where we get some kind of facts out of P11 demonstration, but not all.
Maybe not all, right. So I'm very open to the idea of there being tropes, and in fact I see modes as tropes of God,
Yes.
as it were. And I'm, of course I acknowledge that Spinoza did not develop a logic of relations. The question would be whether there could be a logic of relations that would seem to capture more of what we want to attribute to Spinoza, right? And remember, the thing that has the tropes is going to be God ultimately. So perhaps relations can be seen as monadic predicates of God in some sense. That's a possibility, I think, that we need to be worked out. So I take what you said as, to some extent, friendly, because you can get a lot of the, as it were, an ontology of apparent facts with this language of tropes, which is, I think, more naturally seen as Spinoza, because a mode is just God's being a certain way, having a certain monadic property, perhaps. And so perhaps you can go further with that and come up with more, capturing more of what I want to use as a way of facts. But that would need to be worked out. I didn't work out an ontology of facts in Spinoza. I was appealing to a rough and ready sense that Spinoza does talk about facts, things being the case, which intuitively we catch out in terms of facts. But exactly how that can be done, it's not something that I worked out. I think in terms of the trope theory, I think that's actually very promising. How far that could go, I don't know, and there are those limitations.
Yeah, so I wanted to get back to the methodological questions, because I was having a little trouble pinning down what the methodological differences were. So I was going to try real quick just to articulate the sense in which I wasn't seeing many methodological differences, and then maybe you could help me see where they are. So if we take this thing that we do in history of philosophy and call it text-based philosophical inquiry. So here are some methodological questions you might have where I didn't see much disagreement between the two of you in your presentations today. So there's a question of how you might go about, in the first place, sitting down and reading a text and approaching a text in text-based philosophical inquiry. And you guys seem to be on par, basically, where you sit down, start reading, and start trying to understand the text, right? So then there's the question of what, in general, might count as an acceptable reading or explanation. And I wasn't seeing disagreements on this general level, but it seemed to be more disagreements on a specific level. You guys were citing texts and saying, you say this text means this, but I actually think, race has this different meaning, which seems to be a first order disagreement about what the text means, not a second order disagreement about what sorts of readings are good readings. You might also think there's a methodological question about how to present your findings after you've done this. So you've read the text, you've gotten your reading, so how do you present it, you might think. It's good to sort of congeal things with one story that you can refer back to a lot. Or you might think that's bad because that's misleading, or might lead you to mislead the text. But again, I didn't see so much as of a general disagreement on this, but rather a specific disagreement coming out of your specific reading of Spinoza. So in all these places, I was having trouble seeing methodological disagreement about text-based philosophical inquiry. Now, one place where there does seem to be methodological disagreement is about philosophy more general, and that was with the question of why study the history of philosophy. So you might think for that question, we were hearing some methodological differences about the use of philosophy of text-based inquiry and why you might do text-based inquiry in the first place.
I actually think there we might agree.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, good.
So I think there we disagree.
So am I right that you guys aren't disagreeing about how to do text-based philosophical inquiry?
I actually think we are, although Michael may disagree. Let me try to characterize where it is that I think the differences are, and why I think that on this last point, we may actually wind up being closer together than either you or Michael think that we are. This was actually recently articulated, I think, very nicely by an article by Ellen Nelson in that collection where you have the thing about intuition. There is one way of approaching sort of the reading of maybe not a particular historical text, but sort of a philosopher, making sense of Kant or Spinoza or Descartes, where the assumption is that in one way or another, all of the different parts fit together, and what you're aiming for is a systematic interpretation.
So you go in from the beginning,
With
looking for this.
Looking for, exactly, with the presumption that what we're looking for is a way of putting all the pieces together, that if there appears to be a contradiction, let's figure out how it is to read the text in such a way as to reconcile the differences, the assumption being that, ultimately there is a view, a uniform view, a coherent view that can make sense of all of the different pieces and put them together. And in a way, I think that's where Michael ends up in Spinoza. I don't make that assumption.
I make that assumption.
Well, but the thing is, aren't you don't think that you're looking for that kind of a reading? Or is it just that in Spinoza you think you have found that kind of a reading? He's just that kind of a guy.
I think I found that kind of reading in Spinoza. I'm more open to that kind of reading, but I don't assume going in.
Yeah, when I see differences, certainly you don't want to immediately assume, aha, there's an inconsistency, aha, there's a change. Because, careless reading can lead to just simply misunderstanding these things. And you don't want to be in a position where you're attributing something on the basis of misunderstanding. On the other hand, I think I'm more open to the idea that there's development and change, that a philosopher may begin in one place, may discover a problem with that, may adopt something different, that different works may be, like the Tractatus Theologica Politicus and the Ethics may actually be directed at subtly different audiences. Or that the short treatise may represent an earlier version that involves doctrines that he later gives up. I think I'm more open to that. I may be too open to these kinds of readings, and maybe I don't try hard enough. But at the same time, as Michael, I think, will say, and I don't want to put any words in his mouth, but that he might want to say, of course I'll recognize differences, and of course I'll look for development if it's really there. Of course, at the same time, I will look through, and for example, in the work that I do on Leibniz, which is much more, Leibniz wrote from, the first thing we have is 1663. He dies in 1716. And, I do look for development and where he's learning and where he's changing, and I've argued, for example, that monads don't come in until fairly late. But on the other hand, I also am interested in finding, a stable point of view, commitments that may be realized in different ways in different periods, but that connect the different parts. I think that's one difference. You may not think so.
I think there's that difference is just a difference in degree. I think I'm agreeing with Evan that when I put what I saw as the three methodological differences, they're just differences of degree between, I'm more willing or more open to some things than you are, and you're more open on the flip side. And there's not no kind of really sharp line there. So methodologically, we're on the same spectrum, as it were, just at different, you know, points of the spectrum. But there's nothing sharply divergent there. What is sharply
There are a
divergent?
couple of people who want to.
But I think in the first part of the question period, there's something came up about tourism. I think that I think is maybe a sharper difference between us than I had realized in response to those questions. Because I think that I'm not in favor of this kind of, hey, look, we do history, they do contemporary philosophy, we can talk sometimes, but it's sort of different enterprises. I think is actually much more united there. So that may be a sharper difference, and that's sort of what you alluded to.
If you don't want to follow up, Mr. Crockett, please.
Yeah, I have a question about the difference, because I feel like I see the difference as a Dan steps to think about the puzzle of reading a philosopher as a personal development. So there are certain things about his personal history, like why that person come to this belief matters.
Yeah.
But my person to approach the question in terms of just the logical, the thinking, which idea follow from the other idea. So the personal part is not really matter to the logical development of his thought. So is there a difference on it?
I'm a little hesitant to say that I'm just appealing to the logic of these ideas and this sort of this internal space where there's logic and Spinoza's tapping into something independently of his historical circumstances. Because I think historical circumstance is relevant. I agree with Dan on that. But I am interested in drawing connections to contemporary philosophy, so I may be more inclined to see there as being a continuity of ideas across the ages, as it were. That does come out in some of my work, and so I may be more open to that. But I don't think the historical context is irrelevant. I think it's very relevant. It's just that I might be placing less emphasis on that than
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions was, you know, how do I read a text differently than maybe Michael does? When I'm puzzled about a passage, I may look at another contemporary who he may have had access to, who he may have read, and try to see, well, does putting this in the context of that help me understand what it is that's going on? I rarely look to Donald Davidson. Much as I like Davidson, Quine was actually one of the first influences on me philosophically, and I actually began life as an analytic philosopher. But, and I still find that's, stuff very, very interesting. But I don't turn to it to illuminate Spinoza in the way in which you would be more inclined to.
I think it's fair. Whether that means that greater inclination on my part means that I believe that there's just a kind of eternal form of ideas, I don't think it means that.
This is picking up on Evan's question about where the real difference lies. I think your views can be combined really fruitfully. I'm inspired by, and my advisor will be appalled when I say this, I'm inspired by Bernard Williams' preface to his book on Descartes, where he says that when we're doing the history of philosophy, we begin with a kind of antiquarian approach where we try to discover what the object really was, but the results of that project always leave us with an object which is vague and indeterminate. And so he says there has to be a point where we return to fleshing out the view in terms of vivid ideas which have a resonance for us today. And I don't
He also distinguishes there between intellectual history and history of philosophy.
Really interesting. What I want to suggest is, look, we can begin by doing what Dan does, by trying to uncover some kind of object which represents the intentions of the philosopher, but that's always going to be indeterminate. And then we can start doing what Michael does, which is to try to sort of fill in some of the conditions you think exist for me, relational conditions, putting the text in relation with other texts. I just don't even see a debate here. I think these are two great methods which don't compete with one another, illuminate one another, and can even be combined.
I get to go second though, right?
Can I say something, you know, something, oh, go ahead, please.
No, but I agree totally. I mean, that's why I said that there is, whatever my approach is more holistic or whatever, is this, we're on a spectrum, and the different approaches on the spectrum, I think, are compatible. And I've learned a lot from reading Van's work, and, you know, maybe he's learning something from reading mine, I think we can, I'm sure. But I think that that's all, it's great, and I'm glad these approaches are out
Let
there.
me make this worse. I think I would condemn you both, however, because neither of you really fills out the project. You know, Dan, your approach leaves us with a text which is indeterminate and can't have a life for us. And you are willing enough to bring contextual data. You know, this whole discussion of I mean, just to plug my horn, you know, you wouldn't have had this debate about think if you turned to your colleagues in philology and asked them what function does this term have. So I think really maybe a synthesis is needed, which sort of captures what's
We're all imperfect.
beneficial about both.
I wouldn't say that our approaches are compatible, I would say that they are complementary though. Which is to say that you learn something from doing both of it. Let me say something about Bernard Williams. I will confess at the beginning that I have never been able to finish that book. That I begin it and get so discouraged after maybe 50, 60 pages. And this is why, I mean, there is the distinction he draws between intellectual history and history of philosophy, which I find somewhat problematic. I think that there are different styles and different projects, like our different projects. But I think to draw a radical distinction between the two is not helpful. Here's what it is that I don't care for about his project. He wants to say, okay, how can we understand the meditations? Let's think of the meditator as a pure inquirer. How would a pure inquirer approach the problem of knowledge? And then he sort of, then spins out his interpretation based on that. One of the things that I think is really important to understand what's going on in meditations is to know that Descartes has a reader in mind. And who that reader is any educated person who has been through the university education at that point. Which means very specifically, any educated reader will have gotten, you know, a 2 to 3 year course in Aristotelian philosophy. And you can see him at every point addressing the prejudices that this person is bringing to his project. And to think of this as the sort of blank slate pure inquirer, it seems to me, is a real distortion of what it is that, now it may in a certain sense make the project alive for a certain sort of contemporary reader. On the other hand, looking at the meditations as a work in historical context directed at a reader who comes to it with a particular set of beliefs in mind, also brings it alive in a different way. By, you know, and you can look at things and you can say, aha, that's why he's bringing this up here. And that's why he's bringing that up there. They may not be our assumptions, but, you know, it does in a certain way make it intelligible by putting it into the context. But then, of course, one can ask the question, what does this say to us? And I have no objection whatsoever to another person coming along and saying, now once we have understood what Descartes is really doing, how does this speak to us and what it is that we're doing? But that, it seems to me, may be a slightly different question.
I was the first going to want to argue that there was a metaphysical distinction between these two ways of reading. I might try to argue that, but I think it makes most sense to say first is that the term context, I think, is capable of ambiguity.
Yeah.
I agree with everything that you just said about context, because I think you really can't understand an author unless you think about whom he addressed, whom he expects his readers to have read, and so on. But there's one kind of contextualism, or historicism, which really wants to examine texts as products of their time in a strong sense. You see Spinoza doing that in the Theological Political Treatise. In fact, he may be said to be, in a way, the inventor of that kind of modern textual historicism. And it seems to me that can lead to a kind of perspectivist relativism, in which you think people can only see things, and I think some intellectual historians see things this way, but you can only see things from within the context of your time. And I sometimes wondered why intellectual historians think it's improper when you're interpreting a text to cite anything that's published more than 5 years before it or after it in order to understand it. And I realized that they really think that people are locked into the thoughts that are being had around them, and they couldn't think anything beyond that perspective. Of course, I'm not saying that you're suggesting that, but I'm saying that's a way things can go. And it does lead back to a kind of metaphysical distinction. I think of the moment in the Theaetetus when Socrates is trying to explain Protagoras' perspective, and he suggests that it comes out of Heraclitus, that the reason that Protagoras thinks that truth is perception is that he thinks everything is in motion. There's nothing stable. And so perception is always only just a kind of conjunction between an eye and a thing seen. And there's never a stable object to tell a story about that persists between these episodes of perception. And it seems to me that that raises a question about exactly how one defines the role of context in the history of philosophy. Because one could, these tendencies do get combined in various ways.
Yeah, there's no simple answer.
Right.
That I think, in the end, I think the best thing to do is sort of follow your nose and try to be as sensible as possible. And, in bringing these things in and using them to assess. But the things I also have no objection to saying, well, there are moments in which Frege or Quine or even Donald Davidson might illuminate something earlier, even if, as long as you realize what you're doing is, in some sense, anachronistic. But still, it can't, I have no...
Yeah, that's the question. That's the question. Is it anachronistic to use Davidson?
In an almost literal sense, I think, yes.
No, but the reason I think that's the question, that takes me to the metaphysical question, which is really, is thought subject to time?
Yes.
Well, I think the difference between the two of you.
I think that later philosophy is relevant to earlier philosophy and vice versa. That's where I ended up.
Yeah, but also one question is, what does it mean to say Parmenides is earlier? I'm not sure that for you Parmenides is, in the same sense as for Professor Garber, earlier. I think he might be your contemporary.
I'm very Parmenidean, right? And I think that his ideas are very much related to ideas that Spinoza had and other philosophers after that.
You recognize that he wore different clothes from you, but I don't think that for you is fundamental. So.
I got Kelly first and then questions about. Did you want to follow up on this discussion?
Yeah, sure. It just sounds like, I guess it's more for Michael. I'm wondering whether you're going to be pushed forward from Spinoza and Jacobi and backwards from Bradley to Hegel, and there isn't some deep connection between metaphysics and methodology for you, as you're admiring in Spinoza's own system, that the way that he constructs his manner of doing philosophy reflects his fundamental metaphysical principles. And I think we've been talking about this, but it seems if you're committed to holistic monism, then there's going to be something along the lines of the cookbooks argument,
Sure.
that is going to drive the way that you approach philosophy, which is going to reflect something like a Spinozistic treatise of demonization of the intellect, where we're gradually ascending to the idea of thought and philosophy, or Hegel's project in phenomenology, where the spirit is realizing itself. So I mean, can you really hold to that view, which I think that you do, and say that you and Dan, it's just a matter of you're that close to one another when you, I mean. Yeah.
So you're thinking that maybe I'm really Hegelian, so if I take that view seriously, if I take the Hegelian monism very seriously, then perhaps I can't be as close to Dan as I like to say that.
Well, you could say, so a Hegelian type answer to that could be, well, I'm seeing to the spirit that's at the core of whatever the lower level stuff that Dan is doing, which is the spirit of philosophy trying to realize itself through Dan's historical investigation. I've penetrated the kernel, right, which is what philosophy has always been trying to realize. But I mean, don't these kinds of considerations have to inform the way that you think about the project that you're undertaking?
Right, where it's going, in other words.
Yeah.
Right, and so if I've seen into the kernel of this core of this monistic system, right,
yeah.
then I really don't have much in common with Dan.
Well, in a way you do, right? Because that's the paradox that Dan is.
I am the perfect realization.
Dan is philosophy trying to realize itself at an earlier stage.
And Dan is just working his way to me.
Right. Yeah.
But this is in Rafi's question, it's like none of us is a perfect realization of anything, right? So we're fellow travelers on the way somewhere, and there's kind of a point at which we can work together. We may be going in different directions, but we can talk to each other, and it's nice to do so. But I do want to say that the Hegelian connection is the right one, right? And I'm in favor, in broadly speaking, of Hegel's interpretation of Spinoza, where the reality of the finite is called into question, right?
Yeah.
That was his criticism of Spinoza. But I think that as a matter of interpretation, he was perhaps more correct than he's given credit for being on that point. And so then, on my reading of Spinoza, I think the most consistent way to see Spinoza is denying that finite things fully exist. And so I think that there are degrees of existence, and finite things are just lower on the scale of being. I think that's really where Spinoza is, and I think, so from God's point of view, God doesn't see the distinctions among the finite things, and God just is contemplating God's self.
Well, no, I think that reading of Spinoza, as I think I said to you before, is certainly defensible. I think that that's not the only strand in Spinoza, but I think that that's definitely a strand in Spinoza. But the Hegelian perspective on what it is that we're doing is something that I'm a bit uncomfortable with, simply because I'm not sure. Well, I think of philosophy as a historical and cultural category. And Spinoza's philosophy was not the same as, say, Kant's philosophy, which is not the same as our philosophy. It's not as if it is one project that is being realized over time. And it's partly, I'm reflecting about it, it's partly because of that I feel a bit uncomfortable about using contemporary philosophy in connection with, say, Spinoza, because his project, I think, was just something a bit different from what it is that contemporary philosophers are engaged in. The subject is different.
I think it is. I think there are differences, yeah. But I think that what Spinoza's doing can tell us something about what's valuable and what's not valuable in what we're doing.
I think that that's true. I think that, and it can present, as you suggested, that one can discover that.
Right.
His conception of philosophy, his project, is more interesting than the ones that have come out of, the historical development afterwards.
I think that's true. I think that his conception of philosophy is more interesting because it's, I think, more holistic and more rationalistic in my sense. But yes, I think he's doing something different from what people nowadays are doing. But I think there's a bearing too, where he can actually usefully critique what's going on.
Yep.
have time for one more question. Kevin.
I think it's gonna be a quick one. My question's for Michael, but kind of inspired by Dan's claim that, well, the method that we use as a historian of philosophy should be at least greatly informed by the method that the actual philosopher was using. And I think Michael, you were on board with that. This is the distinction really between sort of going and looking to find something and finding it there, and then getting on board with it. So that said, I would like to better understand kind of what you mean by this methodological holism. I think I've got a decent grasp on the meaning holism, but the methodological.
Did I use the term methodological holism?
Well, so the best way to see these, yeah,
Oh,
genuine methodological differences.
as opposed to the atomism, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right. So what does the?
So I meant a couple of different things, and this may be.
Well, so can I test out, like, I thought I picked out at least
Okay, you
three
tell me.
different. So one is, maybe this is the one most apt to reading Spinoza, a bunch of stuff gets traced back down to sort of one core commitment.
That's right, that was part of it.
Yeah, but a very different sort of holistic philosophy might be one in which sort of a bunch of stuff informs other stuff, right? So the epistemology informs the metaphysics, informs the ethics, informs the philosophy of language. So it's kind of like really broad, maybe reflective equilibrium.
Right, without an overarching principle that.
Yeah, maybe there's some really core commitment.
Right.
But, and then maybe yet another form of holism that I sort of saw coming out here was more the narrative type, where perhaps this philosopher has a certain aim that really is important to them, and that kind of pervades everything. Maybe people who want to read Hume's entire philosophy of kind of being inspired by a certain type of skepticism can be seen as offering this sort of holistic interpretation. Okay, so you can speak directly to that question, but I actually think one thing that might really help me get a sense of what you mean by this holistic approach is if you could name not a current contemporary atomistic philosopher, but a historical figure who you think was maybe not so on board with this holistic approach, or did it to a far lesser degree than, say, Spinoza, and maybe therefore who we should approach with a different method as historians of philosophy.
So a historical figure who was not as holistic as Spinoza was.
Yeah.
So there's the holism of my method of interpreting Spinoza.
Good, but this is why I started off with the point that our method as historians of philosophy should be largely informed by the method of the philosopher. So I figured if you found a philosopher where they're not pursuing this holistic project so much, that could maybe teach us too about the method we should be.
Right, so Hume is not a holistic philosopher, he's an atomistic philosopher. I think you can say that he's okay. Separate. And so he's the flip
That's
side.
the content of his philosophy.
That's the
Right, yeah,
right.
but
And
method-wise.
Method-wise,
Can I give you a candidate?
Yeah, please.
This is a bit controversial, but Leibniz. Who wrote, I mean, we read his metaphysical stuff, and his logical stuff, and his stuff about language, and his stuff about dynamics, but there's also his geology. He was also interested in alchemy and medicine. He also wrote about history and genealogy. He designed an automatic calculating machine, and he did work on the mining machines of the Hartz Mountains. It has been argued that all of this sort of fits together. But it's a tougher one, but if you want an atomistic, I mean, he was just interested in, and then there was his interest in Confucianism as well. He was and in Chinese language. He was interested in everything around him and wrote about everything around him. And one might say, some of it coheres together in chunks, but that, one might argue that this isn't somebody who it's not going to be easy to pull it all together into a single package.
I would agree.
Is that the sort of thing,
That was helpful, yeah. Maybe, is it time? I don't know. But if there is, we can also talk afterwards, just maybe more general characterization of what you mean by this holistic methodology would also be of interest. Like one of the three I mentioned was
The first and the third I thought resonated with the single narrative, I think that was the third, and the single principle overarching. Those are kinds of holism that I would see in my methodology.
Okay.
The first and the third.
Thank you. outside, just around the corner, and then we'll be going to dinner at Tally 2 for about 6:30.